Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. Over the next few hours, we will travel together to one of the most remote places on Earth, a frozen archipelago called Franz Josef Land, where a small group of American explorers once wintered in wooden huts, waiting for conditions that never came. This is a story of ambition and endurance, of long polar nights and quiet days on the ice. There will be moments of hardship along the way, but we will speak of them gently, without alarm or graphic detail. Our purpose here is rest and reflection and the soft unfolding of history. The pace will be slow. The tone will be calm. You may close your eyes whenever you wish. We will keep watch together through the darkness and into the pale Arctic dawn. Let us begin. Take a breath now. We are in no hurry. The Arctic has all the time in the world, and so do we. Picture, if you will, a map of the Arctic. Let your eye travel northward from the familiar coastlines of Europe and Russia, past the Scandinavian countries, beyond the Arctic Circle, until you reach a scattered group of islands roughly 600 miles from the North Pole itself. This is Franz Josef Land, a place of ice and rock, of long winters and brief, brilliant summers. And it is here in the year 1903 that our story takes root. But to understand how a team of American explorers came to build their camp on these frozen shores, we must first travel in the opposite direction, southward across the Atlantic, to the island of Manhattan, where a wealthy industrialist named William Ziegler sat in his oak-paneled study, surrounded by maps and newspaper clippings, dreaming of the pole. By minute 2, you will see the harbor at Tromsø as provisions are loaded aboard. By minute 4, we will stand on the deck of the ship America as pack ice first grips her hull. And by minute 6, you will glimpse the crude wooden huts of Camp Abruzzi, where our explorers will spend 2 winters waiting for conditions that never arrive. But for now, let us remain here, in this quiet room in New York, where the hiss of gas lamps mingles with the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages on the street below. William Ziegler was not a young man when he turned his attention to the Arctic. He had already made his fortune, a considerable one, through the manufacture of baking powder. His Royal Baking Powder Company had become a household name across America, and Ziegler himself had risen from modest beginnings to a position of substantial influence. He owned property. He dined with senators. He could afford, in short, to indulge his passions. And among those passions, the most consuming was the dream of placing an American flag at the North Pole. It was not a new obsession. For decades, explorers from various nations had attempted to reach that elusive point at the top of the world. Some had come close. Many had failed. A few had not returned at all. The pole remained unconquered, a blank space on the map that seemed to mock the ambitions of men. Ziegler had already funded one expedition in 1901, led by a man named Evelyn Baldwin. That attempt had ended in frustration and disappointment, disagreements among the crew, poor planning, and ultimately, no significant progress toward the pole. Baldwin returned to the United States with little to show for the considerable sum that had been spent. Another man might have abandoned the dream. Ziegler, however, was not easily discouraged. If anything, the failure of the Baldwin expedition only sharpened his resolve. He would try again, but this time he would choose his leader more carefully. The man he selected was Anthony Fiala, a photographer and adventurer who had served on the Baldwin expedition and understood the Arctic's demands. Fiala was earnest, capable, and eager to prove himself. He shared Ziegler's belief that an American expedition could succeed where others had faltered. Together, they began to plan what they hoped would be the final, triumphant push to the pole. Ziegler spared no expense. He commissioned the construction of a sturdy wooden ship, christened the America, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of Arctic ice. He ordered provisions in vast quantities: pemmican, biscuits, coal, medicine, scientific instruments, photographic equipment. He arranged for the purchase of nearly 200 sled dogs, essential for hauling supplies across the frozen landscape. He hired scientists, sailors, and support staff, assembling a crew of 39 men who would live and work together in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. All of this was done with a sense of urgency, for Ziegler was in declining health. He would not live to see the expedition's conclusion, a fact he may have suspected, even as he signed the checks that made it possible. But he pressed forward nonetheless, driven by a vision that seemed to grow more vivid as his own strength faded. Imagine him now in those final months before the expedition's departure. The gaslight flickers on his desk. A large map of the Arctic is spread before him, its blank white center marked only by the word unexplored. His finger traces the route northward, from Norway through the Barents Sea to Franz Josef Land, and then, if all went well, onward to the pole itself. Outside the window, Manhattan hums with the energy of a new century. Electric lights are beginning to replace gas lamps. Automobiles rumble alongside horse-drawn carts. The world is changing, modernizing, accelerating. But Ziegler's thoughts remain fixed on a place where time moves differently, where the sun disappears for months, where silence is broken only by wind and ice, where human ambition meets the vast indifference of nature. He would not make the journey himself. His role was that of patron and dreamer, the man who made it possible for others to venture where he could not go. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the dream itself was the thing that mattered most. In the spring of 1903, the ship America set sail from Norway, carrying Fiala, the crew, the dogs, and the supplies that Ziegler's fortune had provided. The old man remained behind, waiting for news that would never arrive in time. But that is a later chapter. For now, let us leave him here in his quiet study, with the maps and the lamplight and the dream of the pole. Pause here with us. Outside Ziegler's window, Manhattan hums with electric lights, but his thoughts drift northward toward ice. The work of preparing a polar expedition is not glamorous. It is slow, methodical, and often tedious, a matter of lists and logistics, of counting crates and inspecting rigging, of ensuring that nothing essential is forgotten. For if something is left behind, there will be no opportunity to retrieve it. The Arctic does not forgive carelessness. In the months before departure, Anthony Fila oversaw every detail with quiet determination. He was not a man given to dramatic speeches or grand gestures. He preferred careful planning to bold pronouncements, and he understood that the success or failure of the expedition would depend not on heroic moments, but on the accumulation of countless small decisions made correctly. The crew was assembled with care. Fila sought men who were not only skilled in their trades, but also temperamentally suited to the long isolation of a polar winter. He needed sailors who could handle a ship in icy waters, scientists who could conduct observations in extreme cold, and laborers who could build shelters, tend dogs, and haul supplies across frozen ground. He also brought photographers and a few journalists, for Ziegler hoped that the expedition would be well documented, a record of American achievement for the newspapers and lecture halls back home. In all, 39 men were selected. They came from various backgrounds. Some had previous Arctic experience, while others were venturing into polar regions for the first time. They were united by a shared willingness to endure discomfort, monotony, and danger in pursuit of a goal that most of them would never reach. The provisions required for such an undertaking were staggering in their variety and volume. Consider, for a moment, what it means to sustain nearly 40 men for 2 years or more in a place where nothing grows, where no game can be reliably hunted, where every calorie and every piece of coal must be carried in from the outside world. Crates of pemmican, a dense mixture of dried meat and fat, were stacked in the ship's hold. Barrels of biscuits, sacks of flour, tins of condensed milk, jars of preserved vegetables, and boxes of tea and coffee followed. Medical supplies were carefully packed. Bandages, splints, medicines for frostbite and scurvy, surgical instruments that everyone hoped would never be needed. Scientific equipment included thermometers, barometers, cameras, developing chemicals, and notebooks by the dozen. And then there were the dogs. Nearly 200 sled dogs were acquired for the expedition, most of them from Siberia, where breeds had been developed over generations for endurance and cold tolerance. The dogs would be essential for hauling supplies on the long sled journeys toward the pole, and their care was a constant concern. They required food, dried fish and pemmican, and they required handlers who understood their temperaments and needs. The ship itself, the America, was a sturdy wooden vessel built to withstand the pressures of Arctic ice. Her hull was reinforced, her bow designed to ride up onto ice floes rather than be crushed by them. She was not a fast ship, nor a particularly graceful one, but she was strong, and that was what mattered. In the early summer of 1903, the America lay at anchor in the Norwegian port of Tromsø, taking on the final stores for the voyage north. The harbor was busy with activity, crates swinging from cranes, ropes creaking under load, men shouting instructions in a mixture of English and Norwegian. The sled dogs, penned on the docks, added their own chorus of barks and howls to the commotion. Phyla moved among the workers, checking manifests, consulting with his officers, occasionally lending a hand with the loading. He was aware that every item carried aboard would have to be accounted for, and that the margin for error was slim. Too little coal and they would freeze. Too little food and they would starve. Too little medicine and a minor illness could become a catastrophe. The crew, for their part, went about their duties with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Some had sailed these waters before and knew what lay ahead. Others were younger, less experienced, still buoyed by the romance of exploration. They posed for photographs on the deck, wrote letters home, and made small talk about the adventures to come. In the evenings, as the midnight sun cast its pale gold light across the harbor, the men gathered in the ship's mess or on the docks, sharing meals and stories. There was a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose, that would be tested in the months ahead, but for now felt warm and reassuring. Families came to see the men off. Wives and children stood on the quay, waving handkerchiefs, calling out farewells that were half lost in the wind. Some of the men would not see their loved ones again for 2 years. A few would not return at all. But on that bright summer day in Tromsø, such thoughts were pushed aside. The provisions were loaded. The dogs were aboard. The America was ready. With a final check of the manifests and a quiet prayer offered by the ship's chaplain, the lines were cast off. The America eased away from the dock, her sails catching the breeze, her bow pointed northward toward the open sea. The expedition had begun. Feel the weight of those crates. The ropes creak gently. Everything is ready. Everything seems possible. The Norwegian coast fell away behind them, its green hills and scattered villages shrinking to a thin line on the horizon, then disappearing altogether. Ahead lay the open waters of the Norwegian Sea, and beyond that the Barents Sea, a cold, gray expanse that would carry them toward the edge of the known world. For the first few days, the sailing was uneventful. The America made steady progress, her engines humming, her sails furled in the calm air. The crew settled into the rhythms of shipboard life, watches and meals, card games and conversation, the quiet hours of maintenance and repair that fill the days at sea. The light was strange to those unaccustomed to these latitudes. As the ship pushed northward, the nights grew shorter and shorter, until at last they ceased to exist at all. The sun dipped toward the horizon in the late evening hours, hovered there for a time, and then rose again without ever fully setting. The sky remained a pale, luminous gold, as if dusk and dawn had merged into a single, endless twilight. Some of the men found this perpetual daylight disorienting. They struggled to sleep, their bodies confused by the absence of darkness. Others adapted quickly, drawing curtains across their bunks or tying cloths over their eyes. In time, most learned to rest when they could, regardless of what the clock or the sky might say. The first icebergs appeared on the third day out from Tromsø. They drifted past the ship in stately procession, great blocks of white and pale blue, sculpted by wind and wave into fantastic shapes. Some were small, no larger than a rowboat. Others were enormous, towering above the ship's masts, their submerged bases extending deep into the dark water below. The crew gathered at the rails to watch them pass, speaking in hushed tones, as if reluctant to disturb the silence. There was something almost sacred about these floating monuments of ice, something that demanded respect. They were beautiful, certainly, but they were also reminders of the forces that awaited the expedition farther north, forces that could crush a ship like kindling, that could swallow a man without a trace. Fiala stood on the bridge, studying the ice through his binoculars. He consulted with the ship's captain, a seasoned Norwegian sailor who knew these waters well. Together, they plotted a course that would thread between the larger floes, avoiding the thickest concentrations of ice while still making progress toward their destination. The dogs penned on the deck grew restless as the temperature dropped. They paced and whined, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The handlers moved among them, offering reassurance and the occasional scrap of dried fish. The animals would be essential in the months ahead, and their health was a constant concern. As the days passed, the ice grew thicker. What had been scattered floes became a continuous field, broken here and there by leads of open water. The ship's progress slowed. There were hours when she sat motionless, waiting for the ice to shift, waiting for a path to open. At last, on a gray afternoon in late July, the lookout called down from the crow's nest. Land had been sighted, low, dark shapes on the northern horizon, barely distinguishable from the clouds. Franz Josef Land. The crew gathered on deck, straining their eyes toward the distant islands. They had traveled more than 1,000 miles from Tromsø, through fog and ice and endless twilight, and now their destination was finally within reach. Franz Josef Land is not a single island, but an archipelago, a scattered collection of more than 190 islands, most of them small, many of them unnamed. They are desolate places, covered in ice and rock, home to polar bears and seabirds but little else. In 1903, they were among the most remote and inaccessible spots on the planet. The America threaded her way through the ice-choked channels between the islands, searching for a suitable anchorage. Phyla had chosen Rudolph Island, the northernmost of the major land masses, as the site for their base camp. From there, sled parties would launch their attempts on the pole, pushing across the frozen sea toward that elusive point at the top of the world. Finding a safe harbor was no easy task. The coastline was rocky and exposed, battered by wind and ice. Several potential sites were rejected before the crew finally located a sheltered cove on the island's southern shore, protected from the worst of the currents by a low ridge of rock. The anchor was dropped. The engines fell silent. For a long moment, the only sounds were the creak of the rigging and the distant cries of seabirds circling overhead. They had arrived. The men stood on deck, gazing out at the barren landscape before them. It was not a welcoming sight, just rock and ice, stretching away under a gray sky. But it was home now, or would be, for as long as the expedition lasted. Somewhere to the north, hidden beyond the curve of the earth, the pole waited. The horizon glows at midnight. There is no true darkness here, only endless, gentle twilight. The work began almost immediately. There was no time to rest, no opportunity to absorb the strangeness of their new surroundings. Winter was coming, and before the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, the expedition needed shelter, sturdy, insulated structures that could withstand months of bitter cold and howling wind. The site they had chosen was a narrow strip of rocky ground at the base of a low hill, partially shielded from the prevailing winds by a ridge of ice-covered stone. It was not ideal, but it was the best available, and it would have to do. Phyla named the camp after the Duke of Abruzzi, an Italian explorer who had attempted to reach the pole a few years earlier, and whose expedition had established a record for the farthest north achieved by human beings. The name was a gesture of respect, a nod to the community of polar explorers who had come before, and whose experiences informed the current effort. The first task was to unload the ship. Crates of provisions, bundles of lumber, coils of rope, barrels of coal, and countless other supplies had to be transferred from the America's hold to the rocky shore. It was exhausting work. The ground was uneven and slippery, covered in patches of ice and loose gravel. The crates were heavy, and there were no cranes or mechanical aids to assist, only the strength of human backs and the occasional help of the sled dogs. The men formed chains, passing boxes from hand to hand, stacking them in neat rows above the high-water mark. The dogs, still adjusting to their new environment, were tethered in long lines at the edge of the camp, where they could be fed and monitored without interfering with the work. Once the most essential supplies were ashore, construction began on the huts. The expedition had brought prefabricated sections of lumber, designed to be assembled quickly into simple but functional buildings. The walls were double-layered, with insulation packed between the inner and outer boards. The roofs were sloped to shed snow. Small stoves, fueled by coal, would provide heat. The sound of hammers echoed across the frozen landscape, steady, rhythmic, almost musical. Plank by plank, the huts took shape. First came the main building, which would serve as living quarters for the majority of the crew. It was a long, low structure, divided into sleeping areas and a common room where meals would be taken and social hours spent. Bunks were built into the walls, 2 or 3 high, with curtains that could be drawn for privacy. Next came a smaller hut for the officers and scientists, a storage shed for provisions, and a kennel area for the dogs. The buildings were arranged in a rough cluster, close enough to allow easy movement between them, but far enough apart to reduce the risk of fire spreading from one to another. As the huts rose, the camp began to take on the character of a small village. Paths were worn into the snow between the buildings. Lanterns were hung by the doors, their soft glow visible from a distance in the dim Arctic light. The American flag was raised on a makeshift pole, its colors bright against the gray sky. Inside the main hut, the men arranged their belongings in the cramped bunks, staking out small territories of personal space in a world that allowed little privacy. Photographs of loved ones were pinned to the walls. Books were stacked on narrow shelves. A few musical instruments, a harmonica, a fiddle, were unpacked and stored within easy reach. The stove in the common room became the heart of the camp. It was here that the men gathered in the evenings, warming themselves by the fire, sharing stories and rumors, playing cards or reading aloud from the small library they had brought. The stove burned coal constantly, its gentle crackle a reassuring presence in the long polar nights to come. Outside, the dogs settled into their new routines. They were fed twice a day, dried fish and pemmican, supplemented occasionally by the meat of seals or walruses that the hunters managed to take. They slept in piles, huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in clouds against the cold air. The work continued for weeks. Even after the main structures were complete, there were endless tasks to attend to: securing supplies against wind and animals, building sled runners for the polar attempts, testing equipment, taking measurements, recording observations. The scientists began their work almost immediately, setting up instruments to monitor temperature, wind speed, and atmospheric pressure. Phyla moved among the men, offering encouragement and direction. He was aware that morale would be tested in the months ahead, and he worked to establish routines that would provide structure and purpose. There were regular meal times, rotating duties, scheduled periods for rest and recreation. A small chapel was designated in one corner of the main hut, where those who wished could gather for prayer. As August turned to September, the light began to change. The sun, which had circled endlessly above the horizon for months, now dipped lower and lower with each passing day. The twilight hours grew longer. Shadows appeared where none had existed before. The men paused in their work sometimes, watching the sun's slow descent toward the southern horizon. They knew what was coming. Soon, the light would disappear entirely, and they would be left in darkness for months on end. But for now, the huts were built, the supplies were stored, the camp was ready. Camp Abruzzi stood on the frozen shore of Rudolph Island, a fragile outpost of human life at the edge of the habitable world. The lanterns glowed in the windows. Smoke rose from the stovepipes. The dogs slept in their piles. And somewhere to the north, the pole waited, silent and unreachable. Listen to the rhythm of the work, steady, unhurried. Plank by plank, the camp rises from the frozen ground. The ship America lay at anchor in the sheltered cove, her hull resting easy in the calm water. For weeks, she had served as a floating warehouse, her hold still containing supplies that had not yet been transferred to shore. The crew moved freely between ship and camp, rowing small boats across the narrow stretch of water, carrying loads back and forth as needed. But as September advanced, the nature of the ice began to change. At first it was subtle, a thin skim forming on the surface of the water overnight, melting again in the weak afternoon sun. The crew noticed it, remarked upon it, and continued their work. This was expected. This was normal for the season. Then the skim grew thicker. It no longer melted entirely during the day. Instead, it spread outward from the shore, creeping toward the ship in slow, patient increments. The water in the cove took on a sluggish quality, as if it were thickening, congealing, becoming something other than liquid. The pack ice, which had remained at a distance during the summer months, began to drift closer. Great fields of white appeared on the northern horizon, pushed southward by currents and wind. The open leads between the floes narrowed and closed. The sea, which had seemed so vast and empty, was gradually filling in. Phila watched the developments with concern but not alarm. He had known that the America would likely be frozen in for the winter. This was part of the plan. The ship would serve as additional shelter and storage, and when spring came and the ice loosened, she would be freed to sail again. But the ice did not behave as expected. Instead of forming a stable, predictable layer around the ship, it moved. Great slabs of ice drifted past the cove, grinding against each other with sounds like distant thunder. Pressure ridges formed where the floes collided, piling up in jagged walls of broken ice that could reach heights of 10 or 15 feet. The America, once floating freely, was now locked in place. The ice pressed against her hull from all sides, gripping her like a fist. The ship listed slightly, her timbers groaning under the strain. The crew watched and waited. There was nothing to be done. The forces at work were beyond human control. One could not fight the ice any more than one could fight the tide or the turning of the seasons. One could only prepare and wait and hope. At night the sounds were loudest. The men lay in their bunks in the huts ashore, listening to the distant creaking and cracking as the ice shifted. It was an eerie symphony, low groans, sharp reports, the occasional rumble of a pressure ridge collapsing. Some of the men found it difficult to sleep. Others grew accustomed to the noise and learned to ignore it. The lanterns burned steadily in the windows of Camp Abruzzi, small points of warmth against the encroaching cold. The stoves were kept burning day and night. The dogs huddled together in their kennels, their breath forming clouds of frost in the air. The sun, meanwhile, continued its slow decline. By late September, it barely cleared the southern horizon before sinking again. The days were measured in hours of gray twilight, the nights in long stretches of darkness relieved only by stars and the occasional shimmer of the aurora borealis. Fiala held regular meetings with his officers discussing contingency plans. What would happen if the ship were damaged? What if she were lost entirely? The supplies that remained aboard, the coal, the food, the equipment, could they be salvaged in time? Were there enough provisions on shore to sustain the crew through the winter and into the following summer? The answers were not entirely reassuring. A significant portion of the expedition's resources remained aboard the America. If she were crushed, those resources would be lost. The margin for survival would narrow considerably. Preparations were made. Emergency caches were established at several points around the camp, stocked with food and fuel in case the main buildings were destroyed. Sled teams were organized and trained, ready to transport supplies or evacuate the crew if necessary. The men were assigned specific duties in the event of an emergency, each one knowing exactly what he was expected to do. But for now, the ship held. The ice pressed, the timbers groaned, but the hull remained intact. The America sat frozen in the cove, her masts rising against the darkening sky like the bare branches of a winter tree. October arrived, and with it, the last of the light. The sun touched the horizon on the 23rd of the month, lingered there for a few moments, and then slipped below, not to be seen again for more than 100 days. The polar night had begun. In the huts of Camp Abruzzi, the lanterns were lit. The stoves crackled and hissed. The men gathered in the common room, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. Outside, the ice continued its slow, relentless work. The ice speaks in whispers tonight, faint groans, soft sighs. The crew listens from their bunks, waiting. There is a particular quality to polar darkness that those who have not experienced it struggle to imagine. It is not merely the absence of light, but the presence of something else, a vast, enveloping stillness that settles over the land like a heavy blanket, muffling sound and blurring the boundaries between waking and sleeping, between one day and the next. For the men of the Ziegler expedition, the onset of the polar night marked a new phase of their existence. The frantic activity of the summer and autumn months, the building, the hauling, the preparing, gave way to a slower, more contemplative rhythm. There was still work to be done, certainly, but the urgency had diminished. What mattered now was endurance. What mattered was getting through. The days, such as they were, began and ended at arbitrary times. Clocks were maintained and schedules observed, but without the sun to anchor them, these markers felt abstract, almost meaningless. Breakfast was served at 8 in the morning, whether the sky outside was black or merely dark gray. Dinner came at 6 in the evening, followed by a few hours of leisure before the men retired to their bunks. The common room of the main hut became the social center of the camp. It was here that the men gathered after meals, drawn by the warmth of the stove and the comfort of companionship. They played cards, poker and whist were favorites, and read aloud from the small library that had been brought from home. Novels, adventure stories, volumes of poetry, and scientific treatises were passed from hand to hand, their pages growing worn with use. Some of the men kept journals, recording their thoughts and observations in careful handwriting by the light of oil lamps. These documents would later provide valuable accounts of the expedition's daily life, the small triumphs and frustrations, the jokes and quarrels, the slow passage of time in the frozen north. Others found solace in music. A harmonica player entertained the group on quiet evenings, his melodies drifting through the hut like smoke. A fiddle was produced on special occasions, its scratchy notes accompanied by singing and occasionally dancing. The dogs, too, had their routines. They were fed and exercised regularly, their handlers leading them on short runs across the ice to keep them fit for the sled journeys that would come in the spring. At night, they slept in piles, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their howls rising occasionally into the darkness, long, mournful sounds that echoed across the empty landscape. Fila worked to maintain morale through structure and purpose. He assigned each man specific duties, rotating responsibilities so that no one was burdened with the same task for too long. There were watches to be kept, instruments to be read, supplies to be inventoried. The scientists continued their observations, recording temperature and barometric pressure at regular intervals, studying the aurora borealis when it appeared, cataloging the behavior of the few animals that remained active in the winter months. The aurora was one of the few sources of wonder in those dark days. It appeared without warning, great curtains of green and violet light rippling across the sky, shifting and dancing in patterns that seemed almost alive. The men would emerge from the huts to watch, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, their faces upturned to the display overhead. No one spoke during these moments. Words seemed inadequate. But the darkness also had its challenges. Some of the men struggled with the lack of light, their spirits sinking as the weeks wore on. There were days when the weight of the polar night seemed almost unbearable, when the walls of the hut felt too close, when the faces of one's companions grew tiresome, when the longing for home became a physical ache. Phyla and the doctors watched for signs of what the explorers called polar depression, a malaise that could afflict even the strongest men during extended periods of isolation and darkness. They encouraged activity, conversation, anything that might lift the spirits. A holiday meal was planned for Christmas. A small celebration was organized for New Year's. These events provided markers in the otherwise undifferentiated flow of time, something to anticipate and remember. The lanterns burned on night after night, small defiances against the overwhelming dark. Their soft glow could be seen from outside the huts, warm and golden, a reminder that life continued in this frozen place, that human beings were still here, still waiting, still hopping. And always beneath everything was the sound of the ice, the distant creaking and groaning of the pack, the occasional sharp crack of a pressure ridge forming. The men learned to live with these sounds, to accept them as part of the background of their existence. The ship America remained frozen in the cove, her silhouette barely visible against the dark sky. No one spoke of what might happen to her. No one needed to. The polar night stretched on, vast and patient. The sun is gone now. Only lamplight remains. Close your eyes if you wish. We will keep watch together. Even in the depths of the polar night, the work of science continued. For the expedition had not been conceived solely as a dash for the pole. It was also a scientific endeavor, intended to gather data and observations that would contribute to humanity's understanding of the Arctic environment. The scientists attached to the expedition took their duties seriously. Each day, at regular intervals, they ventured out into the cold to read the instruments that had been set up around the camp. Thermometers recorded the temperature, often dropping to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Barometers tracked the changes in atmospheric pressure. Wind gauges measured the speed and direction of the gales that periodically swept across the island. These measurements were logged in notebooks, the figures recorded in careful columns by men whose fingers grew numb even inside thick gloves. The notebooks themselves became precious artifacts, tangible evidence of the expedition's contribution to knowledge, proof that something of value was being accomplished, even as the dream of reaching the pole grew ever more distant. The aurora borealis was a subject of particular fascination. The scientists observed its appearances closely, noting the time, duration, color, and intensity of each display. They attempted to photograph it, though the technology of the era made this difficult. The long exposure times required often resulted in blurred or washed-out images. Still, they persisted, capturing what they could. The behavior of the ice was another focus of study. The expedition's observers tracked the movement of the pack, recording when leads opened and closed, when pressure ridges formed, when the ice groaned and shifted. This information would prove valuable to future expeditions, providing insight into the patterns and rhythms of the frozen sea. Wildlife, too, was catalogued. Polar bears occasionally approached the camp, drawn by the scent of the dogs or the stored provisions. The men maintained a careful watch, and several bears were taken for their meat and fur. Seals were hunted when they could be found, their blubber providing fuel for lamps and their meat supplementing the expedition's diet. Seabirds had largely departed with the coming of winter, but a few hardy species remained. The scientists noted their presence, observed their behavior, and collected specimens when possible. Every piece of data, every observation, was considered potentially valuable. The photographers, meanwhile, documented the expedition's activities in images. They photographed the camp, the crew, the dogs, the ice, and the ship. They experimented with techniques for capturing the dim light of the polar winter, the eerie glow of the aurora, the stark beauty of the frozen landscape. These photographs would later provide a visual record of the expedition, allowing those at home to glimpse, however imperfectly, the world that the explorers inhabited. The images were composed with care, framed to convey both the harsh conditions and the quiet moments of daily life. In the huts, the scientists processed their data and wrote their reports. They debated theories and interpretations, comparing their findings to those of earlier expeditions. There was a sense of contributing to a larger project, the gradual accumulation of knowledge that would, in time, unlock the secrets of the polar regions. Fiala encouraged this work, recognizing that it provided purpose and structure during the long months of waiting. Even if the expedition failed to reach the pole, it could still return with valuable scientific contributions. This possibility offered a measure of consolation. The instruments were checked and maintained with care, the notebooks filled page by page. The work continued. Even in darkness, curiosity endures. A thermometer is read, a measurement is logged, the work continues. The ice had been pressing against the America for months, a slow and relentless force that never quite ceased. But in the depths of winter, as the cold reached its most extreme, the pressure intensified. The men could hear it at night, deep, resonant groans emanating from the ship, as if she were crying out in pain. The sounds traveled across the frozen surface of the cove and through the walls of the huts, impossible to ignore. Some of the men lay awake in their bunks, listening, wondering how much more the ship could endure. During the day, inspection parties were sent to assess the damage. They found the hull bowed inward in places, the planking strained almost to the breaking point. The deck had buckled in sections. Water was seeping in through cracks that had opened in the timbers. Phyla ordered emergency measures. Pumps were manned around the clock, attempting to keep pace with the leaking. Supplies that remained aboard the ship were transferred to shore as quickly as possible: crates of food, barrels of coal, equipment of all kinds. The work was exhausting, conducted in near total darkness, in temperatures that numbed the flesh and froze the breath. The lanterns on the ship flickered as the men worked, casting long shadows across the tilting deck. The ice pressed from below and from the sides, squeezing the vessel with a force that seemed almost malevolent. The creaking and groaning grew louder. At night, the situation seemed even more dire. The sounds of the ship under strain blended with the sounds of the ice, a symphony of destruction playing out in the darkness. The men on watch kept their eyes fixed on the America, ready to sound the alarm if she began to break apart. Phyla consulted with the ship's captain and the expedition's engineers. Could the America be saved? Was there anything that could be done to relieve the pressure? The answers were not encouraging. The ice was beyond their control. They could only wait and hope. Emergency caches were reinforced and expanded. Additional supplies were carried inland, away from the shore, in case the ship's destruction destabilized the ice in the cove. Sled teams were prepared for rapid evacuation. The men reviewed their emergency protocols, each one knowing his assigned role. Sleep became difficult. The tension was palpable, even if no one spoke of it openly. The men went about their duties with a quiet determination, doing what they could, accepting what they could not change. The dogs sensed the unease. They were restless, their howls more frequent and more plaintive than usual. The handlers worked to calm them, but the animals seemed to understand that something was wrong. Days passed. The pressure continued. The America held, but barely. Her hull was visibly distorted now, her lines no longer true. She sat in the ice like a wounded animal, waiting for the final blow. And then, one night in late January, the blow came. The ice does not hurry. It presses gently, constantly. The men wait, and we wait with them. The sound that woke them was like nothing they had heard before, a deep, shuddering crack that seemed to shake the very ground beneath the huts. The men scrambled from their bunks, pulling on coats and boots, rushing outside into the frigid darkness. The lanterns on shore cast a faint glow toward the cove, but the ship herself was invisible in the blackness. What they could see, however, was movement. The ice around the America was shifting, heaving, breaking apart and reassembling in new configurations. And then slowly, the ship began to tilt. She went over gradually, her masts tracing a long arc against the starlit sky. The sounds of her destruction were terrible, the splintering of timber, the shriek of metal fittings giving way, the deep groan of her keel as it twisted and broke. The men stood on the shore, helpless, watching the vessel that had carried them so far meet her end. It took several hours for the America to disappear. She did not sink cleanly, as a ship might in open water. Instead, the ice consumed her piece by piece, grinding her hull into fragments, pulling her down into the frozen sea. By morning, only scattered debris remained, spars and planking, torn sails and tangled rigging, all of it mixed with the jumbled ice of the cove. The crew surveyed the wreckage in the gray light of the polar dawn. Some of the men were silent, others wept. A few cursed quietly, giving voice to the frustration and grief that all of them felt. The America was gone. With her went a portion of the expedition's supplies, everything that had not been salvaged in the desperate days before her destruction. Coal, food, equipment, personal belongings, all of it now lay at the bottom of the frozen sea or scattered across the ice. Phila gathered the men and addressed them calmly. The situation was serious, he acknowledged, but not hopeless. They had supplies on shore. They had shelter. They had each other. They would survive. An inventory was conducted. The remaining provisions were counted, measured, recorded. The results were sobering. There was enough to sustain the crew through the winter, but the margin was slim. Rationing would be necessary. Every biscuit, every lump of coal, every ounce of lamp oil would have to be carefully conserved. The men accepted this news with quiet resignation. There was no alternative. The ship was gone. Rescue would not come until the following summer at the earliest. They had to make do with what they had. In the days that followed, a kind of calm settled over the camp. The crisis had passed. The worst had happened. Now there was nothing to do but endure. The lanterns burned in the windows of Camp Abruzzi, steady and unwavering. The stoves crackled. The dogs howled in the darkness. And the ice, indifferent to human sorrow, continued its slow, eternal movement. She is gone. The ship that carried them so far now rests beneath the ice. Let us pause here gently. With the America gone, the expedition entered a new phase, one defined not by exploration, but by survival. The grand ambitions that had launched the mission faded into the background. What mattered now was simpler, more elemental, staying alive until help could arrive. The first task was to establish a rigorous system of rationing. Phila and his officers calculated how long the remaining supplies would last, dividing them into weekly and daily allotments. Each man would receive a fixed portion of food, biscuits, pemmican, dried vegetables, tea. There would be no extras, no second helpings, no exceptions. The coal supply was particularly worrying. Without the ship's stores to draw upon, the expedition had only a limited amount of fuel for the stoves. If it ran out before spring, the huts would become uninhabitable. The men would freeze. Conservation measures were implemented. The stoves were kept burning at the lowest level consistent with survival. The men wore extra layers of clothing, huddling together for warmth. Some of the less essential buildings were abandoned, their occupants crowding into the main hut to reduce the number of fires that needed to be maintained. The days took on a monotonous rhythm. Wake, eat, work, eat, sleep. The work was mostly maintenance, keeping the huts in repair, tending the dogs, monitoring the supplies, taking the scientific observations that continued regardless of circumstances. There was little conversation. The men were tired, hungry, cold. They conserved their energy as carefully as they conserved their food. Meals became the focal point of the day, not because they were satisfying, they were not, but because they provided structure. The men gathered in the common room at the appointed hours, receiving their allotments, eating in relative silence, then dispersing to their bunks or their duties. The cooks did what they could to vary the menu, but the options were limited. Pemmican stew, biscuit soup, tea without sugar. The taste of everything was the same, bland, salty, unsatisfying. The men dreamed of fresh bread, of roasted meat, of fruit and vegetables. Some kept lists of the meals they would eat when they returned home, elaborate fantasies of abundance that helped them endure the scarcity of the present. The dogs were fed from a separate supply, but their rations were reduced as well. Some of the weaker animals did not survive the winter. Their loss was felt keenly, both as a practical matter. Fewer dogs meant less hauling capacity for the spring sled journeys, and as an emotional one. The men had grown attached to the animals, and each death was a small grief. Community became essential. The men who had once valued their privacy now sought out companionship, gathering together for warmth and comfort. They told stories, shared memories of home, speculated about the future. They argued over trivial matters and reconciled quickly. They leaned on each other in ways they had never anticipated. Phyla moved among them, offering encouragement, settling disputes, maintaining discipline. He was aware that his leadership was being tested, that some of the men blamed him for the expedition's failures. He accepted the criticism and continued his work. There was no point in recrimination. There was only the present and the need to get through it. The weeks passed slowly. The polar night seemed endless. But gradually, imperceptibly, the light began to return. Count the biscuits, measure the coal. In this stillness, every resource matters. Breathe slowly with us. When the sun returned to the Arctic sky, pale and low on the southern horizon, the expedition roused itself for one final effort. The pole remained the goal, however distant it now seemed. Phyla was determined to make an attempt. Sled parties were organized. The strongest dogs were selected and harnessed. Supplies were loaded, pemmican for men and animals, fuel for camp stoves, tents, sleeping bags, navigational instruments. The loads were heavy, but the dogs were trained and the men were eager to move after months of confinement. The first party set out on a gray morning in early March, their sleds cutting tracks across the frozen sea. The ice stretched before them in an endless white expanse, broken here and there by pressure ridges and open leads of dark water. The conditions were challenging, but not impossible. Progress was slow. The ice was rough, and the sleds had to be manhandled over obstacles that the dogs could not pull them across. The men pushed, pulled, lifted, and dragged, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Frostbite nipped at exposed skin. Exhaustion set in quickly. At night they made camp on the ice, pitching their tents in the lee of pressure ridges, huddling together for warmth. The temperatures dropped even further after dark and sleep was difficult. The men lay in their sleeping bags, shivering, waiting for morning. The ice, they discovered, was not stable. It moved beneath them, drifting southward even as they pushed northward. Gains made during the day were partially erased overnight. The current carried the ice, and the expedition with it, back toward the direction they had come. Open leads appeared without warning, forcing the parties to detour around them or wait for them to freeze over. Some leads were narrow enough to jump across. Others were wide and impassable, stretching for miles in either direction. After 2 weeks on the ice, the first party calculated its position. The results were discouraging. Despite their efforts, they were barely farther north than when they had started. The drifting ice had negated much of their progress. Phyla consulted with his officers. The situation was clear. They did not have the supplies or the dogs to continue. The pole was out of reach. It had, perhaps, always been out of reach. The decision was made to turn back. The return journey was, in some ways, easier than the outward push. The ice was now carrying them in the direction they wanted to go. But the men were exhausted, their dogs worn out, their supplies nearly depleted. They stumbled into camp a bruisey like survivors of a shipwreck, hollow-eyed and frost-scarred. They had not reached the pole, they had not even come close, but they had survived, and for now that was enough. The pole remains distant, a shimmer on the horizon. The sleds turn back, rest now with the travelers. The failed sled journeys had consumed much of the spring, and by the time the last party straggled back to Camp Abruzzi, it was clear that no relief ship would arrive that summer. The ice remained thick around the islands, choked with pressure ridges and impassable leads. Any vessel attempting to reach them would face the same fate as the America. The men of the expedition settled in for a second winter. There was no fanfare this time, no sense of adventure or anticipation. The novelty of polar life had long since worn away, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that seemed to permeate everything. The huts that had once felt like shelters now felt like prisons. The faces that had once been welcome company now grated on nerves worn thin by months of confinement. The supplies were lower than they had been the previous year. The rationing that had seemed strict before now became even more severe. Meals shrank. The tea grew weaker. The coal allotments were reduced to the bare minimum necessary to keep the stoves alight. The cold seemed more intense this second winter, though perhaps that was merely the perception of men whose reserves of strength had been depleted. The thermometers recorded the same temperatures as before, 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees below zero. But the cold penetrated more deeply now, settling into bones and joints that ached with the memory of countless frozen nights. Illness appeared. Some of the men developed symptoms of scurvy, their gums growing soft and their joints swelling painfully. The expedition's doctors did what they could with the limited medical supplies available, prescribing rest and whatever nutritional supplements could be scraped together. A few of the men recovered. Others remained weak throughout the winter. The polar night descended once again, swallowing the camp in darkness. The sun slipped below the horizon in late October and would not return until February. The men knew this rhythm now. They had lived through it once before, but familiarity did not make it easier. The darkness was still oppressive, still endless, still a weight upon the spirit. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Quarrels broke out over trivial matters, a borrowed tool not returned, a perceived slight at the dinner table, a difference of opinion about the proper way to perform some routine task. These conflicts were usually resolved quickly, but they left residues of resentment that accumulated over time. The lanterns burned on night after night, their soft glow the only illumination in a world of shadow. The men gathered around them as they had done the previous winter, playing cards, reading aloud, telling stories they had told before. The harmonica player still played, but his melodies seemed sadder now, minor keys predominating. Some of the men withdrew into themselves, spending long hours in their bunks, staring at the wooden ceiling or the photographs of loved ones pinned to the walls. Others threw themselves into activity, volunteering for extra duties, anything to keep their minds occupied. Fila maintained his routines, conducting regular inspections, holding meetings with his officers, keeping detailed records of the expedition's status. He was thinner than he had been, his face gaunt beneath his beard, but his determination remained intact. He would bring these men home. He would see the mission through to whatever end awaited. The dogs, too, showed the strain of the long ordeal. Their numbers had diminished, some lost to cold, some to illness, a few to the harsh necessities of survival that need not be described in detail. Those that remained were hardy animals, survivors in their own right, but even they seemed subdued, their howls less frequent, their energy diminished. Christmas came again, marked by a modest celebration. The cook prepared a special meal from hoarded ingredients, a slightly larger portion of pemmican, a biscuit with a scraping of preserved jam, a cup of tea with the last of the sugar. The men gathered in the common room, exchanging small gifts they had made or saved, singing carols in voices that cracked with emotion. It was a brief respite, a moment of warmth in the endless cold. Then it was over, and the long wait resumed. Outside, the ice stretched away in all directions, silent and patient. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human suffering. The aurora flickered occasionally, its colors muted by the haze of exhaustion through which the men now viewed the world. They had endured one winter. Now they would endure another. There was no alternative. Winter returns. The darkness is familiar now. We have been here before. We will endure again. As the second winter wore on, the strains of leadership began to tell on Anthony Fiala. He had held the expedition together through the loss of the ship, the failed polar attempts, and the grinding monotony of Arctic survival. But the burden was heavy, and the cracks were beginning to show. Some of the men questioned his decisions. Why had they not salvaged more supplies from the America before she was crushed? Why had the sled journeys been launched so late in the season? Why had certain duties been assigned to certain individuals? The questions were not always spoken aloud, but they circulated in whispers, in glances exchanged across the common room, in the silences that fell when Fiala entered a conversation. Fiala was aware of the murmuring. He could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the erosion of confidence that accompanies prolonged hardship. He addressed it directly in some cases, calling meetings to explain his reasoning, inviting criticism and responding to it with patience. In other cases, he let the complaints pass without comment, trusting that time and circumstance would vindicate his choices or render them irrelevant. The officers were divided in their loyalties. Some remained firmly supportive of Fiala, defending his leadership against all critics. Others harbored doubts of their own, though they kept these doubts private out of respect for discipline and the need for unity. A few were openly critical, their frustration boiling over in heated discussions that stopped just short of insubordination. There were no mutinies, no dramatic confrontations. The conflicts were quieter than that, a withdrawal of enthusiasm here, a refusal to volunteer there, a subtle resistance to orders that manifested in delays and half measures. The fabric of command, once tight and strong, was fraying at the edges. Phila responded by working harder, by being more present, by demonstrating through his own example the dedication he expected from others. He took on additional duties, relieving men who were exhausted or unwell. He shared the hardships equally, eating the same reduced rations, enduring the same cold, keeping the same long watches. In his journal, which he maintained faithfully throughout the expedition, Phila recorded his private thoughts. He wrote of his frustrations and his fears, his longing for home, his determination to succeed despite the obstacles. He wrote of the men under his command, their strengths and weaknesses, their moments of courage and their lapses of discipline. These entries were not meant for publication. They were a form of therapy, a way of processing the emotional burden of leadership. The journals of other expedition members told similar stories from different perspectives. Some praised Phila's steadiness under pressure. Others criticized his decisions or his manner. All of them recorded the slow passage of time, the grinding routine of survival, the desperate hope for rescue. Letters were written during these long winter nights, letters to wives and children, to parents and siblings, to friends who seemed impossibly distant. The letters could not be sent, of course. There was no way to transmit them, no ship to carry them home. But the act of writing provided comfort, a connection to a world beyond the ice. Some of the men kept their letters, hopping to deliver them in person when rescue came. Others burned theirs, unwilling to burden their loved ones with the raw emotions that had poured onto the page. The choice was personal, private, unremarked upon. The days passed. The tensions remained, never quite resolved, never quite erupting. The expedition held together, bound by necessity if not by affection. And outside, the ice waited, patient as ever. Even in this frozen place, human hearts still stir. Let us observe without judgment, with gentle understanding. In the hierarchy of the expedition, the sled dogs occupied a curious position. They were working animals, essential to the mission's practical operations. But they were also companions, sources of warmth and comfort during the long polar nights. The men who cared for them developed bonds that transcended the simple relationship of handler and tool. The dogs had come from Siberia, mostly, hardy breeds developed over generations for life in extreme cold. They had thick fur, broad chests, and an almost supernatural endurance. They could pull heavy loads across rough ice for hours at a time, and they could survive on rations that would have killed less adapted animals. At Camp Abruzzi, the dogs were tethered in long lines at the edge of the settlement, close enough to be monitored but far enough to keep their noise and smell from disturbing the men in the huts. They slept in piles, huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in clouds of frost against the dark sky. The handlers visited them daily, bringing food, dried fish and pemmican, and checking for injuries or illness. The dogs greeted their caretakers with enthusiasm, tails wagging, tongues lolling, eager for attention and affection. These visits were often the highlight of the dog's day, and of the handler's day as well. Some of the men formed particular attachments to individual animals. They gave them names, some practical, some whimsical, and learned their personalities. This one was bold and eager to lead. That one was shy and preferred to run in the middle of the pack. Another was clever and mischievous, always finding ways to steal extra food or escape from the tethering lines. During the polar night, the dog's howls provided a strange kind of comfort. The sound was eerie, certainly, long, mournful cries that echoed across the frozen landscape. But it was also a reminder of life, of the presence of other creatures in this desolate place. The men grew accustomed to the howling and missed it on the rare nights when the dogs were silent. Not all of the dogs survived the expedition. The cold claimed some of them, illness took others, and the harsh realities of survival in the Arctic demanded sacrifices that the men preferred not to discuss in detail. Each loss was felt, mourned quietly, and then set aside. There was no time for extended grief. There was only the next day and the next, and the work that needed to be done. When spring came and the sled journeys resumed, the surviving dogs threw themselves into the work with an enthusiasm that seemed almost joyful. They ran across the ice, their breath streaming behind them, their paws churning through the snow. For them, the journey was not a failed polar attempt. It was simply running, pulling, being alive. They did not understand the destination, only the movement. The men watched them with something like envy. The dogs lived entirely in the present moment, unburdened by regret or anticipation. They did not worry about rescue ships or dwindling supplies. They knew only the cold, the work, and the warmth of their pack. Perhaps there was a lesson in that, though few of the men would have articulated it. In the presence of the dogs, some of the expedition's weight seemed to lift, if only briefly. The dogs do not know the mission. They know only the moment, the cold, the work, the warmth of their pack. In the absence of the ordinary markers of time, sunrise and sunset, the changing of seasons, the rhythms of work and rest that structure life in more temperate climates, the men of the expedition clung to rituals. These small ceremonies provided structure, meaning, and a fragile sense of normalcy in a world that had become profoundly abnormal. Meals were the most fundamental of these rituals. 3 times a day, the men gathered in the common room to receive their allotted portions. The food was monotonous and meager, but the act of eating together had significance beyond mere nutrition. It was a communal moment, a reminder that they were not alone, that they shared this ordeal with others who understood. The cook, working with severely limited ingredients, did his best to introduce variety. He experimented with different ways of preparing pemmican, stewed, fried, mixed with biscuit crumbs to create a kind of paste. None of these preparations were particularly appetizing, but the effort was appreciated. The men thanked him for his creativity, even as they dreamed of the meals they would eat when they returned home. Holidays were observed with whatever ceremony could be mustered. Christmas was the most important, a fixed point in the calendar that everyone recognized and anticipated. On Christmas Eve, the men decorated the common room with whatever materials were available: scraps of colored cloth, drawings made by the more artistic members of the crew, candles saved for the occasion. On Christmas morning, they gathered for a special meal and exchanged small gifts. These gifts were modest by any standard: a carved piece of driftwood, a sketch on paper, a portion of tobacco saved from one's own ration. But they were given and received with genuine feeling. The exchange represented something larger than the objects themselves: a commitment to human connection, a refusal to let the Arctic strip away all vestiges of civilized life. New Year's was observed as well, with toasts raised in tea or the last of the spirits, and resolutions made for the coming year. Some of these resolutions were practical: to maintain better health, to be more patient with one's companions, while others were aspirational, looking forward to the day when rescue would come and normal life would resume. The men also found meaning in the rituals of correspondence. Though no letters could be sent, many continued to write as if communication were possible. They addressed their words to wives and children, describing the conditions of the camp, expressing love and longing, promising to return. Some read these letters aloud to trusted companions. Others kept them private, folded and stored in personal belongings. The writing itself was therapeutic. It allowed the men to process their experiences, to articulate feelings that might otherwise have remained unspoken. The letters served as a form of journal, a record of inner life during an extraordinary time. Religious observances provided comfort for some. A small corner of the main hut had been designated as a chapel, and services were held on Sundays for those who wished to attend. The prayers and hymns offered a connection to traditions that predated the expedition, linking the men to communities of faith that spanned continents and centuries. These rituals, taken together, formed a fragile architecture of meaning. They could not change the physical circumstances of the expedition, but they could alter the men's relationship to those circumstances. They provided reasons to continue, moments of grace in an otherwise graceless situation. A candle is lit, a toast is raised. Even here at the edge of the world, the human spirit finds occasion to gather. As the second winter gave way to the second spring, the thoughts of every man in Camp Abruzzi turned toward rescue. The sun had returned, climbing a little higher each day, and with it came the hope that a relief ship might finally be able to penetrate the ice and carry them home. William Ziegler had arranged for a rescue vessel before his death. He had anticipated that the expedition might be delayed, and he had made provisions accordingly. The men at Camp Abruzzi knew this, or believed they knew it. They trusted that somewhere far to the south, a ship was being prepared, a crew assembled, supplies loaded. They had only to wait and to watch. Watches were established on the higher ground overlooking the frozen sea. Men took turns climbing to the observation post, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon for any sign of a sail or a plume of smoke. Hour after hour, day after day, they watched. The horizon remained empty. Spring turned to summer. The ice began to break up, great cracks appearing in the pack, leads of open water widening between the floes. The men took these developments as encouraging signs. If the ice was opening here, surely it was opening elsewhere as well. Surely a ship could now make passage. They watched, they waited, they saw nothing. False alarms were common. A distant iceberg, its shape distorted by atmospheric refraction, might look for a moment like a ship under sail. A dark patch on the horizon might seem to be smoke from a steamer's funnel. Each time, hopes rose briefly, only to fall again when closer observation revealed the truth. The disappointment was hard to bear, but the men bore it. They had become experts at enduring disappointment, at absorbing blows and continuing forward. They no longer spoke much about their expectations. It seemed safer to hope in silence. Meanwhile, life in the camp continued. The scientific observations went on, the instruments read, the data recorded. The dogs were exercised and fed. The supplies, diminished but not yet exhausted, were carefully monitored. The routines that had sustained them through 2 winters sustained them still. Phyla organized scouting expeditions to the coast, looking for any sign of approaching vessels. The parties returned with nothing to report. The sea was open in places, choked with ice in others. No ships were visible. The light, at least, was a blessing. After months of darkness, the endless summer days seemed almost miraculous. The sun circled the horizon, never quite setting, bathing the ice in gold and rose and pale Arctic blue. The men emerged from the huts more often, lingering outside, letting the light soak into their skin. They did not speak of what would happen if no rescue came. The possibility was too terrible to articulate. They had survived 2 winters. A third was unthinkable. And so they watched, and they waited, and they hoped. The horizon stretched away, vast and empty, indifferent to their gaze. The horizon is empty again, but the light is returning. That at least is something. Rest your eyes. It was a morning in late July when the lookout's cry echoed across the camp. The word passed from man to man. spreading like wildfire through the huts and along the dog lines. A ship had been sighted. At first, no one dared to believe it. They had been disappointed too many times before, their hopes raised by mirages and icebergs only to be crushed again. But this time, as the men gathered on the shore and trained their binoculars on the distant object, there could be no doubt. It was a ship, a real ship with masts and rigging, her hull cutting through the loosening ice. She was the Terra Nova, a veteran of polar exploration, dispatched by the Ziegler estate to rescue the stranded expedition. She had been fighting through the ice for weeks, her captain threading a careful path between the floes, searching for an approach to Rudolph Island. Now at last she had found one. The men of Camp Abruzzi stood on the shore, watching her approach. Some wept openly, tears freezing on their cheeks. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process the reality of what they were seeing. A few shouted and waved their arms, though the ship was still too far away for anyone aboard to see them. Phyla ordered a signal fire lit, a pile of driftwood and seal oil that sent a column of black smoke rising into the clear Arctic sky. The smoke would be visible for miles, a beacon to guide the Terra Nova toward the camp. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the ship drew closer. The ice was still thick in places, and her progress was measured in feet rather than miles. Hours passed. The men waited, their eyes fixed on the approaching vessel, their hearts pounding with a mixture of joy and disbelief. By evening, the Terra Nova had reached the edge of the cove where the America had once lain at anchor. She dropped her anchors and lowered her boats, and before long, the first rescue party was rowing toward the shore. The meeting was emotional. The men of the expedition, gaunt and weathered after 2 years in the Arctic, embraced their rescuers with a fervor that surprised even themselves. Hands were shaken, backs were slapped, names were exchanged. The newcomers brought news from home, news that was already months old but still precious, and gifts. Fresh bread, tobacco, letters from loved ones. That night, for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, the men of the expedition ate until they were full. The cook aboard the Terra Nova prepared a feast: roasted meat, vegetables, bread with butter, coffee with sugar, and the survivors fell upon it with an appetite sharpened by months of deprivation. The work of evacuation began the following morning. The supplies that remained at Camp Abruzzi were sorted and packed. The scientific records, the notebooks, the photographs, the specimens, were carefully loaded into crates. The dogs, those that had survived, were brought aboard the ship. The huts were left standing, empty shells on the frozen shore. Perhaps someday another expedition would find them and wonder at the lives that had been lived within their walls. For now, they served as monuments to endurance, to the human capacity to survive in the most inhospitable conditions. On the third day, the last of the expedition members boarded the Terra Nova. The anchors were raised. The engines rumbled to life. Slowly, carefully, the ship began to thread her way back through the ice, southward toward home. Behind them, Camp Abruzzi receded into the distance, a cluster of dark shapes against the white expanse of the ice. The men watched until it disappeared from view, then turned their faces southward, toward warmth and light and the lives they had left behind. She is here. The waiting is over. Let the relief wash through you gently like a returning tide. The voyage south was a study in contrasts. After 2 years of confinement on the ice, the men found themselves suddenly surrounded by space and movement. The ship rolled gently beneath their feet. The horizon shifted and changed. The ice, which had been their constant companion and captor, fell away behind them, replaced by open water and eventually by the green coastlines of Norway. For the first few days, many of the men struggled to adjust. Their legs, accustomed to the solid ground of Rudolph Island, felt unsteady on the moving deck. Their stomachs, unaccustomed to the richness of normal food after months of pemmican and biscuits, rebelled against the bounty now available. They ate too much, too quickly, and paid the price in discomfort. But gradually they adapted. The sea air filled their lungs. The sun warmed their faces. The endless routines of survival gave way to the relative leisure of shipboard life. There were no watches to keep, no dogs to feed, no supplies to count. There was only the gentle progress of the ship, carrying them toward home. The men spent long hours on deck, watching the water and the sky. Some of them were talkative, eager to share their experiences with the crew of the Terra Nova, to hear news from the outside world, to reconnect with the rhythms of ordinary life. Others were quiet, lost in private reflection, processing the magnitude of what they had endured. Conversations turned often to the future. What would they do when they returned home? How would they explain their experiences to families and friends who had never seen the Arctic, who could not possibly understand what it meant to survive 2 winters on the ice? Some of the men spoke of writing books or giving lectures. Others wanted only to return to their former lives, to pick up where they had left off, to forget as much as possible. The Terra Nova passed through increasingly familiar waters. The icebergs gave way to open sea. The midnight sun gave way to normal days and nights. The temperature rose, degree by degree, until the men could remove their heavy coats and stand in shirt sleeves on the deck. When the coast of Norway appeared on the horizon, a cheer went up from the expedition members. It was a ragged cheer, weak with emotion, but it was genuine. They had made it. They had survived. The ship docked at Tromsø, the same port from which the America had departed more than 2 years earlier. The men disembarked onto solid ground, their legs wobbly, their eyes blinking in the unfamiliar light. They were greeted by officials and reporters, by curious crowds and tearful families. The expedition was over. In the days that followed, the men scattered, some to nearby hotels to rest and recuperate, others to trains and ships that would carry them to homes across America and Europe. They exchanged addresses and promised to stay in touch. Some of these promises would be kept. Others would fade with time and distance. But for now, in this moment, they were together, survivors of an ordeal that had tested them to the limits of human endurance. They had not reached the pole. They had not achieved the dream that had launched the expedition. But they had come home, and perhaps that was enough. The ice is behind them now. Green shores appear. Breathe in the thought of solid ground of home. The return to ordinary life was not as simple as the men had imagined. During the long polar nights, they had dreamed of home, of warm beds, of familiar faces, of the small comforts they had taken for granted before the expedition. But the reality of homecoming proved more complicated than the dream. Some of the men struggled to readjust. The crowded streets of cities felt overwhelming after the vast emptiness of the Arctic. The noise and bustle of daily life seemed jarring, almost offensive. They found themselves longing for the silence of the ice, even as they had once longed to escape it. Family relationships, too, required adjustment. Wives and children had grown and changed during the years of absence. The men returned as strangers in some ways, bearing experiences that could not easily be shared or understood. Conversations faltered. Silences stretched. The physical effects of the expedition lingered as well. Some of the men had suffered frostbite, leaving them with permanent damage to fingers and toes. Others had contracted illnesses on the ice that continued to trouble them for years afterward. The doctors did what they could, but the Arctic had left its mark. Phyla, for his part, threw himself into the work of documenting the expedition. He wrote reports, organized the scientific data, and prepared lectures for geographical societies and public audiences. He told the story of the expedition honestly, acknowledging its failures while emphasizing the courage and endurance of the men who had participated. He never reached the pole, but he brought valuable knowledge back from the edge of the world. William Ziegler, the dreamer whose fortune had made the expedition possible, did not live to see its conclusion. He had died in May of 1905, just months before the Terra Nova reached Camp Abruzzi. The news of the expedition's rescue came too late for him to hear it. His polar dream, the ambition that had consumed his final years, ended with his passing. The legacy of the expedition was mixed. From a purely geographical standpoint, it was a failure. The pole remained unconquered, and the route that Ziegler had hoped to establish proved impractical. But the scientific contributions were real. The weather data, the observations of ice behavior, the photographs and specimens, all of these added to humanity's understanding of the Arctic environment. And there were less tangible legacies as well. The men who had survived the expedition carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Some wrote memoirs. Others gave interviews. A few preferred never to speak of it again. But all of them had been changed by what they had endured, marked by the ice in ways that went beyond physical scars. In time, the Ziegler expedition faded from public memory, overshadowed by later polar achievements. Peary's disputed claim to have reached the North Pole in 1909, Amundsen's successful journey to the South Pole in 1911. The story of the America and Camp Abruzzi became a footnote in the history of exploration, known only to specialists and enthusiasts. But for those who lived it, the expedition was no footnote. It was the defining experience of their lives, a crucible that had tested them and transformed them. The ice remained with them always, a presence in their memories, a companion in their dreams. The world moves on, but for those who lived through those winters, the ice remains quietly always. What, in the end, did the Ziegler polar expedition accomplish? The question admits of no simple answer. The stated goal, to reach the North Pole and plant an American flag there, was not achieved. The pole remained elusive, a blank point on the map that would not be claimed for several more years. In this sense, the expedition was a failure, a costly endeavor that fell short of its primary objective. But to judge the expedition solely by this standard is to miss much of its significance. The men who ventured to Franz Josef Land gathered data that would prove valuable to future explorers and scientists. Their observations of Arctic weather, ice behavior, and wildlife contributed to a growing body of knowledge about the polar regions. Their experiences informed the planning of subsequent expeditions, helping others avoid some of the mistakes that had plagued the Ziegler mission. The expedition also demonstrated, in stark terms, the limits of human ambition in the face of natural forces. The Arctic did not care about William Ziegler's dreams or Anthony Fiala's determination. The ice moved according to its own rhythms, indifferent to human schedules and desires. The men of the expedition learned this lesson in the most visceral way possible, and they passed that lesson on to those who came after. Perhaps most importantly, the expedition revealed something about the human capacity for endurance. The men survived 2 winters on the ice, facing cold, hunger, darkness, and the psychological strain of prolonged isolation. They did so through a combination of discipline, community, and the small rituals that gave meaning to their days. They leaned on each other, supported each other, and ultimately brought each other home. This is not a small thing. In an age that often celebrated individual heroism and dramatic achievement, the Ziegler expedition offered a quieter lesson: the importance of cooperation, of patience, of simply enduring when endurance is the only option. The photographs and journals that survive from the expedition offer glimpses of this daily heroism. We see men huddled around stoves, playing cards, writing letters home. We see dogs curled in the snow, sled parties setting out across the ice, the aurora borealis shimmering overhead. We see ordinary people coping with extraordinary circumstances, finding moments of grace in a graceless environment. These images and words are the expedition's true legacy. They remind us that history is not only the story of great events and famous figures, but also the story of quiet perseverance, of lives lived at the margins of the possible. The pole was eventually reached. The Arctic was eventually mapped and studied, and in some ways tamed. But the lessons of Camp Abruzzi remain relevant. Lessons about the limits of ambition, the importance of community, and the enduring human capacity to survive. Knowledge was gathered even in failure. Let us honor that, the patient, quiet work of learning. And so we come to the end of our journey together. We began in the study of William Ziegler, surrounded by maps and lamplight, watching as a wealthy man's dream took shape on paper. We followed that dream northward, aboard the ship America, through ice-choked waters to the barren shores of Franz Josef Land. We stood with the crew as they built Camp Abruzzi, plank by plank, preparing for the long polar night. We listened to the ice pressing against the America's hull, and we witnessed her slow destruction, the loss of shelter, of supplies, of hope. We endured 2 winters in the darkness, sustained by rationing and routine, by the companionship of men and dogs, by the small rituals that gave meaning to each day. We ventured out onto the frozen sea, seeking the pole, and we returned without reaching it. And finally, we watched the Terra Nova appear on the horizon, and we felt the relief wash over us as rescue arrived at last. The Ziegler Polar Expedition did not achieve its goal. The North Pole remained unconquered for several more years, but the men who lived through those 2 winters on the ice achieved something that perhaps matters more. They survived, they endured, they came home. Their story is a quiet one, without the triumphant ending that the newspapers of the day might have preferred. But it is a human story, filled with moments of courage and weakness, of hope and despair, of the small graces that make survival possible. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it has been a restful one, a companion for your evening, a gentle passage into sleep. If you wish, take a moment now to reflect on where you are listening, your city, your room, the hour of the night. We are grateful for your company. The lanterns are dimming now. The ice stretches away into darkness. The dogs are quiet. The men are resting. And so perhaps are you. The dream did not reach the pole, but it reached us here now in this quiet telling. Thank you for listening.